I have 2 o'clock here
Oh,
at Cornell.
2 o'clock straight up.
So I think we should get going in all fairness to everybody who's on. So welcome everyone. It sounds like as you're coming on very quickly you're muting. No, we appreciate that. And don't forget to unmute when you're ready to talk. We are in our 4th sessions for the Foundations of Practice in Community Development and focusing on community power structure today. I just want to do a quick check-in to see how everybody's doing, any questions or comments. And one comment that I have is I pulled together the materials that I think we requested during last week's session, and we'll be posting those on Moodle today. So I apologize for the delay, but I haven't forgotten. So, and it did take me a little bit of time to get the set materials from the week before, because they just have an overview at this point, but I will get that posted as well. So any comments, questions, anything anybody wants to share at this point before I introduce today's presenter? Share them in the chat box or feel free to just unmute for a minute. Okay, then we will get going, and actually Dan is going to introduce himself, but today we have Dan Call joining us, and we'll go from there. Go ahead, Dan.
Thank you, and welcome everybody. I am really impressed that you are all logged in and ready to roll right on time, so that's excellent. Today, let me say a word about myself. I am joining you from Kansas State University in Manhattan, Kansas. It's sunny and cool here. It's, well, cool. It's probably supposed to get up to about 60, so actually it's beautiful weather if you're outside. I am a community development practitioner. I coordinate a program that's a statewide volunteer community improvement initiative, as well as I'm the extension liaison. For what end that's on, Heidi? Is that your sound?
Oh, maybe I just shifted my computer. Did something come across that way? I can hear you all still.
Oh, okay. I'm also the extension liaison for the Center for Engagement and Community Development at Kansas State University. My background is primarily in community development work at the local level, but I have had some background and experience in more in the theory part of or the theoretical aspects of community development. And today, what we're talking about is community power and community power dynamics. And while that's not quite theoretical, in fact, it's very real. It's one of those kind of aspects of community that you can't go and point at necessarily, but that you certainly can perceive. When we talk about power, I know that for some folks that seems to be a dirty word, and for some folks they are somewhat neutral about the term power and use of power, and for some folks they see that as nothing negative at all, in fact quite positive. As we're talking about it today, I'm really working off the perception that power in and of itself is neutral. How people apply their power and influence can be for wonderful good and or for personal harm or ill towards others. And so I'm not thinking of power in terms of a value judgment, but really thinking of power as at a community level, the ability to act or influence the ability of others to either act or choose a path of inaction. And I'll come back to that because that was a mouthful. But I'm really thinking in this context of how citizens have the capacity to have an effect on others or their potential to have an effect on others. A lot of the materials that you read about or you'll see that reference power look at power both at an individual level and or, which would be a micro level, or a macro level. And the macro level is more of a community or field level. And that's what we're going to talk about today. But what I hope to cover as we are together are really these things. I hope that after our time together, that you'll have a good understanding of and access to some tools to help you identify the power structure of a community. I also hope that you'll have a good grasp of kind of the concepts of community power, authority, and leadership. And those are terms that sometimes overlap. Also, how power concepts have changed, while many, in many communities, they haven't. I think the concepts have changed while the structures may not have. And also talk a little bit about why community issues in today's reality call for a different approach to or different types of power and leadership. So, given that, I would like, as we go, if you have a question or comment, that you'll please feel free to either post it or voice up, because I know that for this to be most effective time together, it won't just be you listening to me. Let me quickly, though, go back and talk about what we mean as power. And I had mentioned that it reflects the ability to act or the ability to act, and you can think of that just typically as that you have the kind of choice or authority to act. Or power can influence the ability of others to act, which means that you can either allow it or disallow it. Or they may have the freedom, if you will, to act but choose inaction. And frankly, as we're coming up on election time, that's what everybody, I think all the pollsters are trying to wrestle with, is people having that freedom or power to act, but they choose not to. They choose not to vote. And so we say, so why is that? But they have that power to make that choice. Somebody logged in. Do you have a question? Okay. Good. Well, let me ask this. As you think about communities that you're working with, who are the people or organizations who influence the major community decisions? And what I'd like you to do is that's not a hypothetical question. That really is. Bill, I'm going to call on you guys if you're okay with that. I've got Bill Caudle. Is that right? Bill, in communities you work with, what are who are the primary folks, either individuals or organizations, that seem to be major influencers of community decisions?
I'm not sure how I got to be picked first, but that's okay.
Sorry to pick on you.
No, that's all right. It took me a minute to get my mute off there. As I was thinking about this answer, I mean, what really struck me is part of the problem in the primary communities I work in, is there are many people from different facets that have the leadership or the power in their realm, and I'm not sure that they're all working together is the problem.
Okay, no, that's insightful.
So some of the government leaders certainly do. Our longtime small businesses downtown certainly do, and certain various organizations do. Some of the nonprofits and some of the religious leaders. But one of the real challenges I think we're having is that they're not all kind of working together.
Right. No, that's insightful. Thank you.
Sure.
Thanks for sharing that and being willing to be picked on to be first.
Always willing. Thanks.
Kimberly, and I'm picking names off the list kind of at random here, but Kimberly, do you have, from a community you're working with, maybe examples?
Sorry, I missed part of what you said because I was unmuting my phone.
Hey, okay.
Hi.
Hi. Yeah, thanks for being willing to participate here. Who in your community are those people or organizations that are major influencers of community decisions?
I would say I work in a small community called Amro, Wisconsin, and some of the biggest players in our community are actually a lot of the service organizations, and a lot of it comes with they have a lot of people behind them backing their decisions, which is also great because it's a lot of community-focused decisions as well. And then along with some of the usual suspects, the people who are typically really involved in communities, even if it's separate from the service organizations, are some of the real drivers behind some of the changes and just some decisions that are made at the community level.
Excellent. Oh, that's good. You guys, this is good. I'm impressed already just from the two that have spoken at how you kind of are being able to perceive power and what's going on in the community and who's influencing it. So, thank you. So I have a next question, and the same two don't have to necessarily answer it. But the next question then is, and this is in response to the people that you thought of when asked the question, who's making a difference or who's leading those decisions in or influencing the decisions in your community. And that's the question of why did you pick them? I mean, what is it about them? There's actually an associated question. What is it about them that gives them that influence or power to alter or affect the outcome of these community decisions? And anybody that would want to, I mean, Bill could speak back to that about the businesses or organizations that you mentioned, or Kim about the service organizations, or if somebody else has insight of what gives their people of influence that sense of power in the community.
Minnie posted something in the chat box, which might have been in response to my answer to the who question, but I'm not sure. So, Minnie, if you want to unmute *6.
This is Barb, and one of the communities I'm working with, it would be an individual who was retired, but I identified him because when he was working in the community, he had the type of job where he had to build relationships because he worked for a nonprofit. And he's just very successful at that, and he understands the community, the old money in the community, and he's very respected. He knows how to approach people.
That's excellent. Have you talked about social capital during the webinar or in this?
We just introduced it. It's coming up later, so.
Okay, so we won't talk about it. It's not part of my agenda.
No, that's okay.
But you know, two of you have mentioned service organizations as being the power holders in the community, and I think that's really interesting. That's good. So, Minnie, you also had a comment.
Yes, in reference to Mary's part about the squeaky wheels. They
are those too?
Always. When you want them to speak up, they don't speak up. or when they do have the opportunity to speak up, they are the loudest and the most vocal in getting their point across to everyone. And then sometimes they're the ones who can go directly to the other community members and get them to participate by going directly and getting these people to become proactive.
It's interesting, and it's I think you're right. I really do. But it's interesting that sometimes just the people that are, is it because they have enough confidence to be loud and outspoken that they have influence, or what is it about them that gives those folks kind of the authority to take that leader position or to influence others?
They've been around for a while, know the area, know the community, know whom to speak to when they need to.
Yeah, this is Mary. I would add that I think a lot of times people who work in government positions or in policy setting positions really want feedback, and if people don't, if they don't hear from people, if the vast majority of people choose to be silent or opt out, the few people who actually do, speak up end up getting much more weight placed on what they say than maybe it deserves. But just by virtue of the fact that you heard something 3 times in my state can turn it into an issue.
Well, I think that's exactly right. And so this is good. It's interesting, isn't it, that what can give people influence, I'll say, because I was almost going to say respect or authority, but being the loudest doesn't necessarily carry respect or authority, but it does bring with it influence, and often you can pull some weight because you're outspoken about something. That's interesting. This is good, guys. Let's move forward. This is an old perspective. Maybe. It may not be an old perspective. Historically, folks that were the influentials in America were those that were, you know, middle to, middle age, I'll say, 40 to 65. Typically well-to-do. Income that's an asset that gives you some sense of credibility in some circles, or at least influence or power. An above-average education. Not necessarily. I mean, from what we were just saying, you know, being the loudest voice in the community doesn't necessarily mean that you're the most educated. Business professionals, occupational authority brings with it that sense of influence at a community level. I heard, I think Minnie just said, it's that sense of who's the long-term residents. They've got a history. They know the community. Typically, when you look at the history of these folks that were making the decisions, they may not reflect the diversity of the population. Kind of obviously, if they follow these traits of above-average income and above-average education, and you know they're a small subset of the community, and often they control those key resources in the community. So, is this consistent with the people that you'd identified as community leaders? Mary, hey, you're a leader. I just read your post there. How about others? Anyone want to speak up? Does this sound like the community primary influencers of the community you're in? Or if not, let me know.
This is Stuart. It sounds a lot like the typical leaders of the projects I work with, and I work with different communities across the country. The interesting thing to me is that in the groups that don't have people that fit this description, they often seem at a loss for leadership.
Why is that?
I'm not sure. I think perhaps it's because the people that are left may not have the characteristics that the community is used to finding in a leader. Or they don't have the experience being leaders yet. They have an interest in what's happening in their particular project, but not necessarily the skills or experience to be the leader of the project.
Or yeah, that's really interesting, Stuart. Because in a way you could say that it's the followers that are choosing the leader, and if they look at each other and the characteristics of what they expect a leader to be aren't present, that they kind of struggle with figuring out, so who's going to take, who's going to be in charge here? That is interesting.
And then excuse me, this is Minnie again.
Yeah, please.
I've come across persons who don't have enough confidence to feel that what they have to say is important, or that they don't look at themselves as actual leaders.
This is Heidi. I would just wait.
Does that make sense?
I would just add something to that, Minnie and Stuart, based on what you're saying. There's an initiative with Cornell Cooperative Extension of Tompkins County in New York State that's called the Natural Leaders Initiative, and it's trying to address just that. It's taking folks that are coming from communities that aren't typically represented in the traditional power structures or community organizations, and doing leadership training with them. But the flip side of that is that they are helping folks in those traditional structures understand how to engage people who may not have that confidence but are seen as leaders within their own communities. And I think it's a really interesting concept, particularly given the things that you folks just mentioned.
It is. And so happy birthday too, Heidi. I'm reading your text there. Just recently turned one of those numbers, and I'm guessing it's probably the smaller of the two.
Well, it just I would just say that it's just been funny because I keep hearing about the under 40 range and everything we're doing there. And I thought, okay, what happens after 40? So this makes me feel a little better.
There you go. You become influential. Yeah.
Well, I just celebrated a birthday on Monday also. This is Minnie.
Happy birthday, Minnie. And
Thank you.
See, isn't it great to know that you're getting more influential as you celebrate those benchmarks?
Yes. And that's part of being community leaders there. You're speaking out more. You hit a certain age limit, and you don't care. You just say what you need to say because you've been there, done that.
That's right. Or your hearing's going and you have to just talk louder just to... so you become the loud voice in the crowd. No, that's fantastic. Back to your comment, I think that you're right on in that some people don't perceive their own power, their own influence. And in fact, I think most don't. Let me give a quick aside. I work with a couple of leadership programs here in Kansas, and typically we do an influence mapping exercise. And if you think about this, you do the same thing whenever you're applying for a job. You sit down and you kind of map out, what are my skills that might help me be a good candidate for this position? What education is relevant or makes me the best person or that is going to apply to the situation? So what education do I have? What networks or resources do I have? Is it people? Is it connections? Is it links to agencies? Is it a brother-in-law or family? Or as well as then, are there other resources that I bring to the position that's going to make me the best person or the best candidate for the job? And if you think of it in those terms, what you're really doing in a way is making an influence map. In other words, what is it about you that might influence or help to allow you to influence others toward a goal or an outcome that you're working toward? And so we do this influence mapping. And typically people underestimate their own influence. I often will ask them, how many of you are involved in an organization or group at a local level? And I get hands that go up. How many of you are interested or involved or represented with a group at a regional level or state level? And fewer hands go up. What about a national level? Fewer hands yet. What about an international level? Are you linked with any kind of international groups? And no hands go up. Or maybe we'll get an occasional hand that goes up. But if you think back and you think, well, you do have political representation at the state level and at the national level. You do have typically folks who are members of organizations. Maybe it's your church that has a national body or an international body that's involved. They're involved in clubs or organizations. It might be World Wildlife Federation, or it may be some other national type of effort for whatever cause that they're involved in. But they start to realize that they do have connections and they do have those networks that they can tap into that may be sources of knowledge. They may be sources of information that you can go to through your own professional work and professional networks. I know you have statewide and probably national and perhaps international connections. And all of a sudden we start to realize that we do have an incredible access to both information and resources as well as individuals that can help us be more influential in the work that we do. But I think that recurring theme of we don't think of ourselves as leaders, and we don't think of ourselves as sometimes, and we don't think of ourselves always as somebody that's influential within a community. This is good. So tell me, Heidi, what you're posting.
Oh, so this is just the link to the Natural Leaders Initiative that I just mentioned. If you want to learn more about that program that's designed to help strengthen leadership skills of folks that are in communities where leadership isn't traditionally drawn on from in traditional leadership opportunities.
Well, let me go from here. Thank you for posting that.
Sure.
Let me go from here into thinking about power in kind of a field perspective or at a community level and what that looks like. And there are some, I'll try to go somewhat quickly through this, but there are some competing theories. If you go back into the research and you look, and these aren't chronological, but these are some, and actually the sequence they're in doesn't matter. It's just really different ways that folks have identified theories of how power is held in a community. And the first one I wanted to talk about was pluralism. And the idea of pluralism is really that individuals have power. It's kind of what we were just describing. This is the way democracies work. There's not any dominant source of power. It's the capacity that each of us, through our voice, our vote, the way we spend our money, the way we make our decisions, we are able to have and wield power in our communities. And so it's through those choices that we are all individuals, that together we come together and we vote on election day. And again, that's kind of our system. This kind of theory probably was spearheaded by Robert Dahl. His study was published, Who Governs Democracy and Power in an American City, back in 1961. And so there are also techniques, and we'll talk about those in a minute, of how do you best track action or power at a community level when you're following this idea of pluralism. But what I'd like to ask you guys is a question of, can you think of an example of pluralism? I mean, do you have an example that you'd like to share of either a community or an organization that really reflects this description of power? Mandy, are you on? Do you have
I'm still here.
Okay.
We've got 20 people listed. Why aren't they speaking up? That's what we talked about, pluralism. Pluralism, right there. You're calling on many, and no one else is speaking up. I'm thinking of my homeowners associations, where you have their top-heavy and don't spread out a lot of the leadership among the other members.
Right. Good. Anyone else? Patricia, maybe. Dramatic entrance. Is that you, Patricia?
This is Joe. And this might be a little bit of a stretch, but I think of a mall where people go shopping for Christmas and making choices that way, exercising power with the money you have for the individual themselves and the desires and the wants they have. There's no real dominant store. There's just lots of different choices.
Yeah. I mean, this isn't. This is a perspective of saying, right, each consumer basically is going to influence the market depending on how they spend their dollars. That's
and Don has put in New England town meetings as an example.
That's a great example. And in fact, if you go back to the last presidency, I guess in my mind, I'm thinking that the concept of pluralism kept coming through. And the reason I'm saying that is that when Obama was elected, President Obama was elected, he had the highest number of small donors that supported him. In other words, it was a very broad base of smaller individual givers as opposed to one or two corporate endorsements. And so, again, it kind of reflects that idea of power. The other thing that they did during the election process to really draw that out is you heard a lot about Joe the Plumber. I mean, Joe the Plumber is kind of this amalgam of, it's the average American guy, that's just this American citizen. And that's the idea that the election was about us, about the common person. And so to me, that's an example of this kind of concept of community power projected at a national level. If you were to try to draw a picture, now I know these are pretty amazing visuals here, but this is the best I could do. These little dots are supposed to represent each of the citizens, and or it's not just individually. Pluralistic says sometimes these folks will come together in organizations, especially around a cause or a specific effort. So you might have this kind of collaborative grouping, and maybe that's your community action organization. But basically it's saying that, once that cause is addressed, that folks disband again, and it becomes they've got their own voice. So here's my question. In a community that would represent this type of power, how would you go about mobilizing it? Don, could you say a word about, you talked about town meetings, but how would you go about kind of mobilizing support or energy or power in a community that's very pluralistic like this?
Well, I don't know about how it would apply particularly to a New England town meeting, because there's generally a small group and you can get the word out. But in larger areas, there are tools now to crowdsource information, to put things out to a community at large, and identify people that would coalesce around a particular idea or a particular activity.
I hadn't thought of that, but that's right.
Well, we're doing work here in Northern California around broadband and trying to get. It's a fairly rural area, extremely rural area, and trying to get people interested in the subject is we're trying to put out information and using typical crowdsourcing type activities, Twitters or Facebook and things, to get people interested in some of the issues that are incumbent with broadband and the implementation in rural communities.
I had what struck me. I think that's a great example. Is I hadn't thought about the Facebook or the networking, but you're right. You can get a lot of information to a broad group of people, and they kind of collaborate or clump or group according to their interest. That's a good example. Anyone else? Thank you, Don. Let me move on and talk about some other theories. Actually, and these are a little out of order because pluralism came as kind of a response to the next theory. And the next theory was one that came out of Floyd Hunter in 1953 and then was really made popular by C. Wright Mills in 1956. But it's the idea of elitism, that it's not all about all the powers in all the people. It's really about that a small group of individuals control the power, the resources, and the agenda of what happens in our public life. It's a much more hierarchical structure. It's viewed as basically the top down, and they're making the decisions for the rest of us. We had an ag extension person here by the name of Barry Flinchbaugh that for many years talked about kings and kingmakers, and he would say the king is that elected person that is in the position, they're the voice, they're the person that might be the mayor or an elected official, but the kingmaker is the person that before they make those decisions, they go back and consult the wisdom and expertise and approval of this other individual, the kingmaker. In Kansas, that's a very popular theory, that it's very hierarchical. It's kind of in my view, it's the man behind the curtain of the Wizard of Oz. That there's somebody back there pulling the strings and making the decisions. Typically, this approach is thought about in terms of based on those that have wealth and privilege. And when you're discovering or trying to assess this, and we'll talk about that in a minute again, but the reputational technique is an example of how you identify this elitist type structure of a community. And so my question is, if you think about a community organization that might represent this type of structure, does anybody have an example that they would share that this example gives maybe a better representation of how power is held than our first representation of being pluralistic.
Hi, this is Tricia Fowler. We are also a small community in northern Vermont. We have 3 different individuals that own considerable amounts of land, and it has definitely been a controlling factor in our development in town, where they do not want to sell lands. They only want to lease land or do rentals at this point. And they are definitely looked at in our community as the kings of the community.
Yeah. Thank you for stepping up. Is that similar? Do others have a similar experience in that a lot of the decision making is really kind of nested or held with among a few individuals or an individual?
Stuart here. I've run into that in communities where, without being able to connect to the elite of the community, an organizing group has found that they cannot be effective. I work with community groups that are trying to organize new retail food co-ops, which aren't always at the top of the knowledge of people that have been well established in community over ages, and we run into some communities of old money, old families, and certain families have an awful lot of power.
That's right, and it's unavoidable, and it's kind of like things will pass or things will fail dependent on their nod. I think I appreciate both those examples, because I think there are parts of in some communities that's very much still kind of the dominant structure of how decisions get made.
Yep. Hi, this is Bill. I've lived in a couple of college towns also, and in a lot of cases I found that it's the college that whoever the administrators are that wield a lot of power in the community.
That's interesting. Are they smaller communities?
Mostly, yeah. It's because the college or university is so important to the community and its economic conditions and so forth, that in essence others may give up that power to the university.
This is Joe. I just wanted to echo what Bill just said, and I live near right outside of Hamilton, New York, Colgate University, and Colgate pretty much owns all of downtown Hamilton, and they put a lot of money into it to attract students. So even though it could be seen a negative thing, there's been a lot of good to it.
And it's a beautiful town too.
But you're right. I mean, there are these names that come up: Ford, Colgate. Oh gosh, you can name
Bruton Smith in North Carolina, who owns the racetrack.
And just by name that those are folks that have a lot of power, and maybe it's because they had wealth, or maybe they had or they've invested a lot to get the community to where it is today. But those are dominant decision makers.
And Barb and Carol mentioned sometimes dominant employers also, and I've observed that too, is that they pull a lot of strings.
That may have been similar to what the university is in that community, but yes.
And Don, I think, had a comment as well.
Well, I was going to say, beyond individuals or even large organizations, the public service sector much depends on the agenda can get set by who has the control of the budget. Thinking, in our area, the economic development side has pretty much fallen by the wayside when the state, killed the Department of Commerce. But the workforce development side pretty much controls that agenda at the local community level, because they get money directly, so they can get money directly from the federal government, but they also maintain that influence because of the funding that they do get. They're able, money talks.
Yes.
Well, and we have it in my area of Concord, where you had the textile mills that was torn down. The properties was bought out by Mr. Dole, and then, of course, him building a research campus in the area. You've got now the community is impoverished, but you have a big money maker who's come in and built up the research area, and so of course city leaders are listening to him.
Excellent examples. So if you were to try to draw this, and you know my stunning visuals here again, it might be one dot. To represent this power dynamic, you just put one dot, Mr. Dole. Or really, it's hierarchical. It's kind of top down. You got the power holders at the top, and the rest of us are maybe underneath the peak of the pyramid. There are other theories. So let's keep going, because some of these I'm hearing. I think I'm hearing what you're saying is that yeah, these they hold true. And what you'll find is that in different communities, you'll get different power structures, and over time, you may have shifting power structures. So here's a third theory, and that is goes back to really Max Weber, and his theory is that class-based theory of power, it's similar to elitist, only rather than saying it's one individual or one organization, that it's those that are controlling the economy are controlling that political agenda, and it may be a class system. Who is in charge is not as important necessarily as that they are facilitating profit making. And so it's similar to elitism, but it's saying that it's kind of a shared ruling class that is a dominant power structure in a community. And so from the examples that you've shared so far, is this a deviation or different? Do you have an example of a community that it's a little more broadly shared than maybe an individual or an organization, but it's still hierarchical in terms of class-based?
Well, this is Mary, and this might be stretching a little bit, but it seems almost that we have some of this emerging in our small farms versus large farms in the state.
Mm-hmm. I don't know if that's stretching or not. I mean, I think that you're right. There's a clear deviation there, and maybe that is impacting whose voice is driving the agenda.
Mm-hmm. Well, and it has a lot to do with, who gets the resources, who has, it's sort of that old thing of like, well, it takes money to make money, and it takes resources, I guess, to get resources.
Right. Oh, that's good. Thank you. Yeah, I'm going to call on Joanna. I haven't heard from her yet. Are you on, Joanna?
And Joanna actually had written me earlier, and she may not be able to get on verbally, but
okay.
She can respond by the chat box.
Okay. Well, I'm just going to try to engage her, but she may not be on the phone. So, let me keep going.
If you give her a chance, she may want to respond in the chat box, because she just can't. I think we just can't hear her is the issue. Yeah.
Right. Okay. I'll share my stunning visual. It looks kind of probably like what North Dakota felt like. That's not a cloud and snow, but that's meant to be a social class as kind of the ruling power structure over the rest of us. So I keep saying that, but so there's and again, I don't know how much help that is to try to map it, but in a community, what you may find is that the folks that live on the hill have bigger houses, or that there are certain neighborhoods that tend to have a little bit more influence, or a certain side of town that tends to drive the agenda and manage the resources over the rest. And so I say the hill. I don't know if that's true where you're at too, but I'm a native of Iowa, and now I'm living in Kansas. But I still notice that some of these stately mansion-type houses are up on the hills, and some of the smaller homes are down in the valleys. And I'm not sure how that came to be, but I've actually heard a community that I work with say, you know, you got the people on the hill, and they don't want to follow our agenda. And it was a clear division, I think, in their mind of where people live. So, okay, let's see. Let me keep going. I think there's just one other here that I'd like to identify as a kind of predominant or competing theory, and this is a little bit of a hybrid. It's a variation on the class-based theory that we just talked about, and elitism, and it's called the growth machine. And this comes out of Harvey Moltke. In 1976, published The City as a Growth Machine. And the growth machine is a coalition of groups that pursue economic gain in a community, and they work to encourage growth and capture those economic benefits. And so what you tend to see is that growth machine might be a group of kind of interested stakeholders that are developers, construction companies, insurance persons, real estate agents, commercial or rental property owners, banks, business developers, that come together and work toward identifying an agenda that typically is about growth, and it is typically dominated by, again, that economic gain that these folks have common interest in and are sharing. Is that a description of a power structure in a community that you could see or relate to? Does anyone have an example of a community that is a growth machine community?
Mandy's got a comment in the chat box about this, about the Tourism Development Association.
Yes. Yeah, you'll see sometimes chamber of commerce type, and not to say that the chamber is the only entity, but I've seen communities whose chambers are just very much in competition with each other. Michelle has an example or sees that type of power structure in their community. Brian? Yeah? Okay. Well, and it's pretty hard to map this design too, but it's a cluster of professionals that are really around a special interest, and they may have a single interest cause, and typically that's that they're going to develop that industrial park, they're going to recruit, or they're going to do some kind of project that brings you know, new blood, new energy, mostly new money to the community. So,
David, this is Bill.
Yeah, Bill.
I just an observation, perhaps a question. It's the third and the fourth, which are the class base and the growth machine. It seems to me that in a lot of times those can eventually evolve into the type 2, which is the elitism, or the more specifically the kings. I'm thinking of the economic class that works together, and eventually one person out of that group emerges as the king, if you will. And the very same thing could happen with the growth machine. If you've got the bankers and everybody working together, eventually somebody or some small group of hers evolves out of that to be almost the king and his court, if you will.
Yeah, that's interesting. It is. That is, and that, I think you're right. I think that there may be trends where a community could evolve in that way. You may get with that growth machine, if you started to try to do that elitism type approach, that you might get some competing factions. Whereas you get in other words, if you are starting to identify individual leaders or elitist type power holders, that they would come in conflict with one another if power or the usurping power was on their agenda.
Yeah, I'm not so sure that it's necessarily a good thing. I just could see it as a natural result of that process.
Well, and see, I really like your insight there, because what you're seeing is that it's none of these are cemented in and fixed. I think that communities can change their power structures. Power structures can change, and I think that they may or may not. Sometimes they're pretty stuck. Some of that elitist conversation the examples I heard sounded like they go back quite a ways in history. But otherwise, yeah, I think you can start to see that there are shifts and trends. Let me ask this question then. So as a community developer, I mean, as a person that's online here and interested in this, why is it important for us to understand these dynamics? I mean, I just ran through 4 different kind of theories of perceptions of, you know, how power might be aligned in a community. Who cares? Somebody, please tell me you care. Why is it important to understand the dynamics of power in a community?
Well, it seems a little obvious that you're not going to have a lot of progress without getting those people on board. If you have them on your side and as champions to your cause, you can go a long ways quickly. If you don't, you're going to be fighting every step of the way.
Definitely, yeah. I mean, knowing the power and how the community responds to power is going to be pretty important, because those folks that are in that perceived position of power can kill whatever effort. So definitely that's one, and/or can help it be successful. Boy, the comments are coming fast, but somebody else, I liked your comment. Was it Nikki? Minnie, yeah, it said, so as to best meet the need of the community. Yeah, and the broader community. I mean, I think you're right that there are some folks that may not be heard or represented. To interrupt them, Mary?
Well, I think I was just building on what Minnie said, is that sometimes I think you have to, you know, and if you want to understand how these power dynamics work, and if you want to change them, you have to sort of acknowledge that they exist.
Yeah. And Katrina, like you're right on too, is that your programs, you may just be pounding your head against the wall and not be able to have an effective program if you've ignored or are fighting against that power structure. So, yeah, your answers are right, and maybe they're just really obvious, but I think it's to know sometimes who has the authority to make those decisions, who's controlling the resources, who isn't part of the decision-making process that maybe should be, how to build community power from both within and outside of the community. And I think it enables us to develop more effective community programs, and I think that's what you were just addressing. But these actors also, I think, determine, first of all, if issues are addressed in the first place or just ignored, and they're not even accepted onto the community agenda. And sometimes there's some work by Gaventa, a book called Quiescence in, oh gosh, does anybody know what I'm talking about? It's in an Appalachian community. Quiescence is that sense of that the population is kind of quiet and not taking action, even though the power structure is a very dominant power structure. Somebody logged on. Are you familiar with that work by Gaventa? Okay. So knowing also the outcomes of community decisions, the actors will determine what gets passed and what doesn't, as well as the allocation of resources needed for community action. So let's talk a little bit about how do you figure out if you're not sure? I mean, you're kind of observing, but maybe you could see any of these different type approaches being represented in the community. Typically, there have been 3 different models that have been used, and these are a part of a worksheet that I think is shared on the Moodle site, so you'll have access to this. But the reputation approach to identifying community is just basically that. You go and you might interview some folks and say, tell me the 3 people who are the most powerful people in town. And then you go to your second person and your third and your fifth and your 10th interview, and these can be very informal. But you start to kind of keep a list of who the citizens of a community see as those people that have power or influence by reputation within their community. And some of those common names are going to come up again and again. So basically you would go through a kind of an interview process that would cross-reference and identify somebody that some of these key power stakeholders. The second effort is called positional, and that's basically just saying, based on power positions, who's in the decision-making situation. The positional analysis basically is just going through and identifying who's been elected and who are the group organizational leaders, who's the head of the civic organizations, who's the deacon of the church, and who is, all these different kind of positions that have influence. It's a little bit different than the reputation, but may not be. You may get similar results. It may only reflect the organizational structure of the community, though. The problem with that is that it does this approach implies that the position means that you have influence to make decisions. And there may be situations where just because you're in a position, maybe similar to the kings and kingmaker approach, just because you're in a position doesn't mean that you really have the authority to make that decision. Sorry, I was going backwards on you there, wasn't I? And so, good job. Thank you, Heidi, for referencing quiescence in an Appalachian Valley.
It's the beauty of Google.
Fantastic. The third approach is event analysis, and that's where you would go back and say, okay, so when has positive change really happened in this community, and who was behind it? Who was involved? Who are these people that seemed to have brought about that positive change? And so, again, there's a way of kind of tracking back and trying to determine, based on who's involved, who has that reputation, or I'm sorry, not reputation, but who has that power within the community. Now, there's been some, when I went back and earlier had mentioned these, event analysis tends to find it's a good way of identifying pluralistic. It basically says, let's get all those names of all those people that were involved in all these events, and you might be able to tell who stepped up and took power, and whether it was broadly shared or whether it was individual, based on events. The positional may lean toward, it may lean toward the elitist, although not necessarily. And reputational typically kind of follows that theory that you're trying to find who those pinnacle people are by reputation. In other words, when you do the reputation and you ask 10 people and you pull out the common names, you're trying to find who's at who's at the top. If you identified, if 10 people all identified different names, though, that might be an indication of a more pluralistic approach or representation of power in a community. So can you kind of see how these different approaches might be used to be able to identify the power structure in a community?
Minnie, I think you've had your hand up for a while. Did you have comments?
No, I'm done. I was just following up back from the last comment in reference to groups fitting in and everything.
Okay.
I'm done. You can take my hand down.
Okay.
Sorry, Manny, I didn't see your hand up, so.
That's okay. I forgive you. I'm one of the little people. You know, I don't speak loud enough for the voices.
I don't believe it. I don't believe it. Okay, let's keep moving on. What I have provided in the homework is a page that allows you to kind of go through and collect names. And you might go out and interview people. You might look at the newspapers. You might go and you could use any of the three of those, but to try to gauge again. So as you look at a community, who are these folks that are influencing the decisions that have taken place or that will take place? And so there are three different models of kind of trying to assess the power structure of the community. And again, I guess to summarize, some of them have been criticized to say that, well, they point to a specific type of power structure depending on which approach you use. But there have also been many folks that looked at them and say, well, not necessarily. I mean, you get the answers that you get, and you tease it apart, and you try to read it the best you can to determine, so are there key people of influence that I want to be inclusive of or attentive to as we are hoping to make some community change, or is it really a broad, evenly held approach to community power? So, again...
Dan?
Yes.
This is Don, and in addition to what you listed there, there's some other things that are starting to happen that I've seen at any rate, talking about social network analysis in addition to event analysis. And that's looking at the connections that individuals have both to positional activities as well as their reputation and other groups. And if you can analyze that, you can start to see who the key actors are in a particular activity or organization or geography.
In a way, you're going to talk about social networking, I think, yet, and social capital, but it does relate to that bonding, and whether it's a small group of networks that's tightly held versus bridging, which is a much broader network that you can still have strong social ties, bridging ties, but that are connecting over a broader perspective. But are you familiar, Don, with some software that you can use to do that social analysis?
The work that I've seen is by Valdez Krebs, Krebs, I believe. And I think he did his work with Case Western Reserve. I thought he's out of Ohio.
I know that there's networking software that you can access and that helps do this. And I know that an example of it, Jeff Sharp out of Iowa State, I think about, might be a couple of years ago now, has done some social networking, basically community mapping based on that social networking. Valdez Krebs, though, that's good. That's a good network, and Heidi's probably all over it already.
Yeah, and Stefan Getz, who was the presenter last week, has done quite a lot on network analysis.
Well, so I feel like I may be going slow. You guys are way ahead of me. So as you think about these community power holders, they're all often the folks in a community that have access to capital. And you've already gone through the capital model, is that right? Community capitals model?
Just very briefly on the first week we went over it, yeah.
Okay.
We'll be unpacking it a little bit more later, but yes.
Well, let me say that if you think of each of these capitals as community-held assets, either individually or community-held assets, these power holders are typically those folks that have access and control of that local capital. And so as you think about the interplay of these capital areas, and I know this may be, if you haven't talked about it yet, a lot, it may be a little vague, but what we're really talking about in this sense about community power is that political capital aspect. It's social capital. Social political capital have much in common, but political capital consists of the community organization, connections, voice, and power of individuals within that community. And that's really what those assessment methods are trying to identify, is how are these folks connected, organized, and do they have influence on decisions? And so this political capital concept is the ability of either a group or an individual to influence the distribution of resources within that community, that social unit, and including setting the agenda. And it's interesting that it seems like in my world in Kansas that that everybody's got access to the agenda, and we're very democratic, and everybody has voice, and all the issues that are important are being addressed. And I received a newsletter from the El Pueblo neighborhood group in Wichita, which is a Hispanic neighborhood, primarily Hispanic neighborhood. And I received a newsletter yesterday, and there's an article in it about not being heard and being really just ignored about this community group and about the issues that are important to them. And so I will say that I keep getting these kind of wake-ups in my own world of, hey, not everybody does feel like they have voice and access to setting the agenda about what are the topics, what are the issues that we really need to be talking about. And what we're addressing in terms of community development is just that. It's how do you identify within a community who has and can have access to both access to resources and involvement. And so in many ways it's looking at how do you help people gain that influence or access to being able to have their needs addressed. I'm sensing somebody would like to jump in. No? So why would you want, if you were to, let me back up and say this. If you think of power as a fixed sum, as a fixed pie, then anybody that would tap into that power would cut into the potential for others to wield it. In other words, if your loss is my gain and my loss is your gain, and that's how we perceive our own influence, this is a very threatening topic. And talking about power becomes very personal and probably very conflicted and confrontational. However, if you think about power as something that grows when you give it away, in other words, if I can help you reach your goals, how does that impact your perception of my influence? Or how do you feel about me if I can help you achieve or have access to resources? And so if you start to think about power as something that grows as you give it away, and that isn't just a fixed asset, then you start to really look at this concept of shared power as something that might be valuable. My question, though, is why would you want to do that? Why would you want to share power? Or why would a community want to embrace a shared power approach? I've got many, thank you, logging in saying that new startup groups need to be able to access or have a sense of power.
And I wrote that, this is Minnie again, such as I'm working with a new community group that is just organizing. They need that shared power right now so as to lay out all the groundwork in terms of where they're going for the future. so that there isn't someone who's over everyone else and is telling all the little people what to do, because everyone is on the same playing field right now.
Mm-hmm. And that's incredibly important, to have them also have that sense of knowing that it's not all just futile, and that, you know, it's not going to make a difference and they can't make an impact anyway. You've got to be able to help them feel that sense of potential and energy that comes from shared power.
Yeah, this is Mary, and I think a lot of groups actually don't really want shared power. I mean, I think that they say they do because it's the right thing to say, but I think when push comes to shove, they do it. They throw up a lot of barriers to it.
I think you're right. I think that it's that sense that, yeah, but if I share power, it means I have less power.
Right.
I want to share it.
Right. And I just want to do a time check, Dan, because you asked me to. It's 3:10, so we've got about 20 minutes or so.
Okay.
I think the other thing it's not only relinquishing power, but I think sharing power in certain ways is it requires a lot of work.
Yes.
It's easier to control everything in certain ways. So I'm not.
You're right.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think that's a good thing, but I do think that it takes work, and so sometimes by default it's easier to just go with the status quo.
Well, you're right. I think that, and another example of that is that power, a lot of times we relate power to control, and by controlling things we can move it ahead at the pace that we're comfortable with.
Yes.
Or not. Yeah, and we don't want to have it not be in our control. That just doesn't feel right. Other thoughts? Let's see, who haven't we heard from? Mandy, have you been? Did I already ask Mandy? Are you on? Hi, Mandy. You're a fast typer.
Sorry.
No, that's all right. So if you were to create or go about to help create a shared power community, what might you do?
Well, to be honest, I'm new to community development, so I'm learning as I go. And right now, I work, as I said earlier, with the Tourism Development Association, and I'm trying to get them to kind of organize and share power in the community and help build it to be a better place. So I think maybe that is part of the way, and I'm, I guess, just kind of pushing them to work with different groups and try to include more people in that type of thing.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. You're right. You know.
Does that answer your question?
Well, it does, and I mean, in a way, this is a really difficult question, and it's kind of like the key question of, okay, guys, if we're all community developers, how do we do this? And in a way, sometimes we make it too difficult. There is an article, and it's referenced in your. There's an article that's referenced in your resources at the end by Brennan and Israel, and it was published in the Community Development Society Journal in 2008, and it's called. Let's see, I'm holding it here. It's called "The Power of Community," and again, it's referenced at the end of this PowerPoint. But if you go and read that, to me, that was one of those portal journal articles, and by that I mean that you realize you're walking into a room that all of a sudden it's not just a room; it's a hallway of continued connections of kind of a maze of rooms and great information, and all of a sudden you feel like you've walked into a whole new world. That was the effect that on me of this article, is that I felt like, hey, these guys have done some great work in pulling together lots of ideas. And one of the key ideas for me that helped kind of cement this together is that when you organize, when you help a group come together and find some kind of common objective, they start to influence community power. I mean, they really can't help it, because now you've got collective group of individuals that have some kind of common focus, and that's become the agenda. Now, if you've helped them to identify their own focus, you're giving them or allowing them access to start to touch that power. They're starting to mobilize. They're starting to develop what they call agency, and that's that capacity for local action. And there's some literature that implies that sustainability or resiliency in a community needs to have this sense of people that have a sense that they can make a difference, that they can make a change, that their voice is important, and that they have a role to play in this collective group called community. And so as you start your work, I think, as community organizers or community developers, and you start to pull this group together, you realize that they are bringing together resources and ideas, and when they can converge on some ideas or topics or efforts that they're working toward, that brings influence. It generates influence and power with that activity. It's much like the growth machine model. There's a group of folks together, they've got a shared agenda, and they're working toward it. And that's how they're spending their time, that's how they're spending their resources, and hopefully they're bringing about some kind of community change. And for those that aren't involved, they step back and they say, wow, what's given those people all the influence? Well, it's the fact that they are organized and moving towards some kind of common goals. So what's great is that you can say, well, so I realize now that I can start to create that sense of power. An interesting thing that Brennan and Israel pointed out in their article is that sometimes getting organized and having choice can have positive consequences, and sometimes it can have negative consequences, and I had to give that some thought. Basically, they're saying, let's look at an agenda. Hey, look at this, I got a little pointer. This is cool. Okay, oops.
Now he's going to go crazy.
Yeah, I know. Isn't this fun? So negative consequences of not having any choice, basically they're saying, hey, this is a group of people that are subjugated. They don't have a voice, they don't have a choice, and people are kind of telling them what to do, where to go, when to be there, and it's a group that really doesn't have strong identity or even a sense of being empowered. The positive consequence of that down here is he said that there are groups that, if I've got this right, I'm pretty sure, although he's calling it abandoned agency, a positive consequence would be a situation where a community doesn't have a choice in what happens, but they're fine with that. And I know that might sound a little strange, but let me give you an example. My parents live in a small community in Iowa, and there's an industry that really runs the community. It is by far the dominant industry in that community. And these folks have an incredible amount of influence because basically, if it weren't for them as that major employer, I think you guys have shared examples of this too, that community would probably not do well on its own. But these are very good benefactors. I mean, this agency is community-minded. They've built fitness centers. They've helped pave streets. They've helped do wonderful things for the design of the community and for the community itself. And so they're good social players. And what they would say is the positive consequence of this not having a choice is that the citizens of the community say, well, it's okay, you know, we're okay with this. If they decide they want to do something, we're fine with that. So and actually the company in that community does pretty much what it wants to do, and the folks in town are benefiting from it. And so in that sense, they're saying there are positive consequences, even though they have really no choice in what happens in the future or the agenda of the community. Now, that may be a unique situation, but I do know of situations like that, and perhaps you could also see spots where people have a benefactor of a community, and they're just going along with it, and that's fine. because they're benefiting from it. The having a choice, negative consequence, I thought was also interesting. And what Brennan and Israel are talking about in this situation is that sometimes you'll get a group that they're kind of led to believe that they've got choice and that they've got some room to make decisions, but they don't have full autonomy. They really are kind of like kids in the classroom that aren't really allowed to do whatever they want, but they're given a little bit of rope. And so the sense here is they're saying that there are some negative consequences with choice if it isn't really a bona fide official that they really have a lot of choice. It's just kind of a pseudo situation. And that one, actually, I can see also that there are still some primary decision makers in some communities I've worked with that allow a small group to organize and do some nice things for the community and feel good about themselves. But they're still really not free to set the agenda of the community. I mean, they're basically kind of patronized and allowed to do some small things, but really not given complete agency, as Brennan and Israel would say. And again, agency is that capacity really to take action and have access to resources. And so that's what they're talking about when they talk about authentic agency, is that this group of people, oops, my arrow went away, but in this group, they have a choice about what happens. They have access to resources, and they're working to make some positive change, set the agenda, and move their community forward. So as I say this, how does this relate to, or do you have any questions about any of these kind of four categories as Brennan and Israel have teased it apart? I see the comment. Mandy Swisher says, oh no, I'm here. Yeah, that was earlier. Mary, yeah, trust has to be high in those situations, and that, I guess, is the no choice, kind of abandoned agency. Positive.
Yes, I was talking about the example you were giving about your parents, and I was thinking, because I bet otherwise as soon as it flips over to negative consequences, I bet things happen quickly.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and in this case, there is a sense of kind of, it's that sense that they're just satisfied and sitting back and not taking voice. So. Well,
I see that a lot with our town tax structures, and that most of the time people are pretty happy, and then all of a sudden if there's a switch or a big change or an increase in the tax rate or a reassessment, things go crazy for a while, and then they settle back down, and people are very happy, or not happy, but I guess willing to pay.
So if you were to, we'll do this quickly because I know we're checking on time, but if you were to say in the 21st century, what are the assumptions or expectations of citizens, community members? What are the expectations that they hold in relation to exercising community power? Anyone quickly want to field that?
Well, I think they all have a vested interest in the outcome of whatever their decisions are.
Yes. So they want, basically, I think there's an expectation of that opportunity for participation.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Good.
And transparency, I would say. I think they want transparency from leadership.
I hear that, yes. Nikki said communication. Good. Accountability. Ethical decision making. I mean, to me, these are some of the kind of the benchmarks of as a citizen. I want to be able to participate. I expect that I'll be able to participate. I expect that I'll have some sense of being able to have a decision or power use that's fair, that's just. I would expect that I think most citizens would like to see that the use of power benefits all the community members. And maybe that's not true of all citizens. But like you say, transparency, accountability. So in community development circles, I found this, this is also a handout in your materials, but I found this incredibly helpful in that sometimes I get really stuck in Kansas. And this is one of those documents that comes out of the World Bank. And it was actually, it's on the worldbank.org website. It's called A Real World Guide to Theory and Practice. I'm sorry, it's called Scaling Up Local and Community-Driven Development, A Real World Guide to Its Theory and Practice. It's there on the slide. It's kind of hard to see, but it is, again, in your materials. That's where I was reading. What I found amazing about this is that they were saying, hey, you know, we've been doing some community development around the world for quite a few years now, and as you look back into the 1950s, 60s, 70s, so mark that because it's hard to see, 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, through 90s to 2000, and this says 2006 and forward, that our approach to community development has shifted. Where it used to be pretty technical fix-oriented and expert-driven and top-down, we're realizing that in third world countries, actually worldwide, in developed countries and undeveloped and underdeveloped countries, over and over and over again, it's showing us that this use of power that's top-down or hierarchical doesn't work to sustain communities. And so that really the sum of that report is that we've gone from in the 60s a theory of kind of decentralized or top-down to in the mid-2000 or 2006 and forward an approach that looks at locally driven. They call it local and community-driven development. Not just that they're participants, which is up here, but that it is really the citizens that are driving the change. And so you can see kind of this progression of involvement goes from really domination, where we tell you what to do, to we'll consult you, but still we'll do what I say, to here where we'll say, okay, well, let's do it together, to here that says, we really need you to tell us and tell each other and identify together what is it that you'd like to see and how might we get there working with that community group. So I think that you'll find that as a valuable resource. And so as we're getting closer to our time here, you know, the question is, so how do you build power? Community or civic involvement in identifying what are the issues, what is it that is on the agenda that's important to us, and helping those citizens or have citizen or civic involvement in identifying what issues are important to be addressed. The second is they need to have decision-making and voice in prioritizing and talking about how we want to address those. A third key area to build power within a community is to develop structures or systems that then allow for that shared power and decision-making. And this isn't just my ideology, it's really saying that this is what folks around the world in community development are discovering, is that these resilient and sustainable efforts need to be respectful and listen and involve the power of those people that are affected or impacted by those decisions. And so that it brings about this sense of shared leadership. And that can happen through shared leadership development programming. I will say, I've been working with some groups and some conversations about leadership development and how power is shared or not shared in communities. And I've had communities tell me, oh yeah, you know, we went from a very hierarchical system to a very shared leadership perspective, but now it's kind of going back to the hierarchical system. And I found that really interesting, but I think that it's helping people to be engaged is a lot like getting out to vote. I mean, once you know, oh yeah, I've got a choice, but sometimes we forget to exercise it. And yet it's through that exercise of getting people involved, engaged, focused, and working on and working with issues together that really, to me, is the common thread of community development and how you address and work with power in communities. So, having said all that, I'm running very close on time. I think we've got a chance to answer questions or thoughts. Anyone like to pitch in?
Any final comments? Dan, I just want to say thank you so much for the presentation. I really enjoyed it, and I trust everybody else did, since they're sticking with us to the bitter end on a Friday afternoon.